I'm going to get rid of this and start the slideshow. All right, yes, I got it. The recording's in progress.
Okay, guys.
Oh, and I was going to turn off my camera, but I didn't this time, so what the heck, you'll see.
Yeah.
Okay, if you could please mute your microphones if you have them on,
Yeah,
that would be great. I'd greatly appreciate that. So this week, we're going to leave the medieval period behind us, and we're going to concentrate on Tudor London. And this is the period pretty much defined between 1485 and 1603. So please mute if you haven't done so. And our agenda today is really going to be sort of what it has been in the past few weeks. So we're going to be looking at some very historic key events in Tudor London. We're going to look at daily life, and we're going to spend some time looking at Tudor pastimes and entertainments. Tudor architecture, I'm going to save until next week when we do the Stuart period. So we'll put those two together. But as you can see, we're kind of leapfrogging ahead again several hundred years because we're starting in 1485. And as always, our emphasis is really going to be on London. So this is not a detailed, in-depth look at Tudor monarchs. Now, that said, we are going to be spending some time talking about Henry VIII because he features very prominently in one very big event that happened at this time. And in your materials, the supplemental materials, there are some materials on the various Tudor monarchs. I believe I put those in there. So, but we have to start. We can't look at the Tudor era or Tudor London without talking very briefly about the War of the Roses. This is a very complicated, dense topic that could take at least 1, 2, 3 sessions all on its own. So this is going to be the Cliff Notes version. This is going to be a really 2-minute, very, very basic overview. I did provide one handout with dates and key battles and things if you're really interested. And if you want more information, I'd also be very happy to, just send me an email, ask the office, they can contact me, and I'd be happy to provide you with more information on the War of the Roses. But this is going to be a very quick overview. It was a 30-year dynastic struggle between two branches of the Plantagenet dynasty. And the one branch was the Lancasters, and they were represented by this red rose on the left here. And the other branch were the Yorks, and they were represented by the white rose on the right. And we'll talk about this rose a little bit later, but that's why it was called the war, nicknamed the War of the Roses. So when we start looking at the War of the Roses, we're starting with Henry VI, and he was from the Lancastrian side of the family. He came to the thrones of both England and France before he was even a year old. His father was the very famous Henry V, who had a lot of success battling the French, won a lot of territory. But his father died when Henry was still a baby. His father had married a princess of France, the King of France's daughter. And therefore, Henry, the future Henry VI, was also heir to the King of France, Charles VI. So Henry V and Charles VI both died within months of each other. And here's this little baby who is supposedly the king of both of these kingdoms now. Now, obviously, in his minority, when he was young, he had advisors and counselors kind of ruling on his behalf. But when he was around 15 years old, they decided, okay, he's old enough, considered old enough to rule on his own. Unfortunately, Henry was not like his father before him. He was a pretty weak king. His interest in government was, I'd say, sporadic at best. He wasn't very good at picking advisors. He really, and in the court at this time or any time, you had a lot of people who were jockeying for positions, jockeying for power. There were people in both branches of this family who believed they deserved to be on the throne more than he did. So they smelled blood. When they see someone weak, when they see someone vacillating, like Henry VI was, he couldn't make up his mind about things. He had poor advisors. He wasn't all that interested. He really couldn't control the power struggles that started to grow up around him. And in addition to this, he was not the warrior king that his father was. So he lost Normandy, which was a huge loss for Britain in 1470, and that further eroded any kind of authority or respect that he had. This was pretty bad. So Then to cap it all off, he suffered a mental breakdown, a physical and mental breakdown in 1473. So what happened was, I'm sorry, 1453. What happened was he suddenly went into this catatonic state. He just, after losing Normandy and losing these battles, he went into this catatonic state. And he, for 18 months, almost 18 months, he was just, don't know if it was a deep depression or what it was. He wouldn't talk, he wouldn't engage with anybody. So at this time, his cousin, Richard, the Duke of York, on the left here, he was the great grandson of Edward III. And so he stood in for Henry. He was the Lord Protector, if you would. After about 18 months, Henry did recover almost as quickly as he suddenly went into the catatonic state. Suddenly he just kind of snapped out of it. But by this time, civil war had really started to break out in England between these two factions, between the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. And that's what we call the War of the Roses. In 1460, York, on the left here, he was killed in the Battle of Wakefield, but his son took up the fight. And his son defeated the Lancastrians in 1461, and he crowned himself Edward IV. And this is the guy you see here on the right. But then that kind of, after that, there was like a 10-year-long game of sort of ping pong back and forth between Henry VI and Edward IV and their supporters. So alternatively, you would have Henry VI running off into exile, and then you would have Edward IV running off into exile. Henry VI was imprisoned for a time and then let out of prison. Again, can't go into all the details here, but I'm happy to supply more information if you want it. Ultimately, Edward IV destroyed the Lancastrian forces in May of 1471. Henry's only son was killed at that time, and Henry was imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he died shortly thereafter. So you've got Edward IV now, clearly on the throne, no more competition for the most part. But in 1483, he died. Now, his sons were too young to rule. He had two young sons. They were too young to rule. So his brother, the future Richard III, who we see here on the right, he took the throne, and he became King Richard III. And in doing so, he placed these two young boys, who you see on the left here in this very stylized, romantic Victorian painting. He placed them in the Tower of London. And originally he said, well, it was because the older boy, the elder boy, he was going to have his coronation soon. And, you know, as we talk, monarchs would often spend the night or a few nights in the Tower of London before they had their coronation. Well, he put them in the Tower of London, first the elder son, then he got the younger son who was being in the sanctuary, you know, kind of being away from all of this. He convinced his mother to let him out, put him in the Tower of London. And shortly thereafter, both boys disappeared and were never seen again. There's been a long-standing debate about, was Richard III responsible for their death? Was somebody else responsible for their death? Did they even die? What happened to these boys? I did a whole presentation on Richard III for Love Living at Home, and it is on the YouTube channel, on Love Living at Home's YouTube channel. So if you're interested, you can look it up there. It's still a bone of contention. People still argue about who was responsible for this. But in any event, in the 1600s, there were some renovation works going on at the Tower of London, and they did find the bones of a couple of young children. Those were thought to possibly be these two children, but DNA analysis was never done on them. But the bones were moved to Westminster Abbey, put in a special urn, and that's where they are today. So now you got Richard III on the throne. The disappearance of these boys made him rather unpopular, and there are a lot of rumors swirling around about this. And he had also alienated significant parts of the nobility. And this kind of set the stage for, you know, maybe it's time to try to bring someone from the Lancaster branch back into this. People were disillusioned. A lot of people were disillusioned by Richard's rule. And again, if you want to go back and watch that other presentation, we go into more detail there. And one of the people that people started rallying around was a guy named Henry Tudor. He was a Lancastrian. He had a somewhat dubious claim to the throne, but they started seeing him as possibly the person who could take on Richard. So this is just a little family map, if you will, family tree of how the houses of Lancaster and York were all combined and related to one another. So Henry Tudor, this guy was interesting. So his father was Edmund Tudor. He was the illegitimate half brother of Henry VI. He was born of an illicit union between Henry VI's mother. After Henry V died, she took up with this Edmund Tudor and had a couple of sons. So Henry Tudor's father, Edmund, was the illegitimate son of that relationship, and therefore a half brother of Henry VI. And he also had another brother named Jasper. And Henry VI recognized both of these individuals as his brothers. They weren't legitimate claims to the throne at that time, but he did recognize them as his brothers, and he bestowed earldoms on both of them to recognize their status. And they both became staunch supporters of the House of Lancaster. Now, in addition to having royal blood through his father, the future Henry VII, Henry Tudor, his mother also had royal blood. She was related to John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. So she had quite a bit of royal blood coursing through her veins, but also it was through an illegitimate relationship. So again, it was a little dicey. So, however, Henry Tudor was seen as a possible claimant to the throne, and so it wasn't safe for him to hang around England when he was young. He spent most of his life in exile in Wales and later France, as did his mother. So we come to August 1485. We have Richard III on the throne. He has alienated all of his nobles pretty much by this point. And we have growing support for this guy, Henry Tudor. So Henry leaves France. He arrives in Wales on the 7th of August. He marches more than 200 miles into England with an army. And originally, Richard III is pretty confident, yeah, I can take this guy. My forces vastly outnumber his, which they did. But in the middle of battle, and again, I'm making this very short, people started seeing, and again, the loyalties to Richard were still kind of sketchy, even the ones that were supposedly on his side. When they started seeing the tide turning and looked like the Lancastrians were going to win the battle, a lot of Richard's nobles deserted him and either didn't fight, left the battlefield, or went over to the Lancastrian side. So Richard was defeated. He was killed on the battlefield, and Henry VII declared himself king. He was king. So his victory really did end the Plantagenet dynasty as we know it, and it heralded the launch of the Tudor era. And Henry VII cemented this deal by marrying Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth of York was the sister of those two boys who disappeared in the Tower of London. So he married them. So now you've got a Lancastrian married to a York, and he put the two roses together and created the Tudor rose. And that's what you see here in the middle. So that began the Tudor dynasty. But before leaving the War of the Roses, I do want to again, briefly mention these two women. When I do get around to doing the Queen Consort series, they are both featured in that series, so that will be coming at some point. Two Margarets, who played a very big role in the War of the Roses. The first on the left here is Margaret of Anjou. She was married to Henry VI. Her marriage was a part of a peace settlement at the time between France and England during the 100 Years' War. The peace didn't hold, obviously. But she was a very powerful woman. She was responsible for getting rid of Richard, Duke of York, at one point when he was taking over while her husband was ill. And she pretty much ruled and led armies in her husband's place when necessary. She was said to have been very intelligent, feisty, fierce, strong. However, after she was captured, Henry was put in the Tower. He died there shortly thereafter. She was captured and ransomed off to the King of France, and sadly went to live and die in poverty there. So spoiler alert if you come to the later lecture. On the right is another Lady Margaret Beaufort. She was the mother of the future Henry VII. She married very, very young. She was pregnant at only 12 years old, had a horrendous birth, horrendous pregnancy and birth. She was widowed during the War of the Roses, and she almost died at the hands of Richard III. So again, she had blood in her, royal blood in her, but it was illegitimate blood. Although later the family, the Beauforts, were legitimized, but they could not succeed to the throne, and they and their heirs were banned from succeeding to the throne. But she was also another driving force behind helping her son, the future Henry VII, get to the throne. She was quite a fierce woman in her own right. So I just wanted to give a little nod to both of those women. But this takes us to the Tudors. So the Plantagenet dynasty that immediately preceded the Tudors began with Henry II back in 1154, and it lasted for 331 years, had a total of 17 monarchs. The Tudor dynasty, on the other hand, lasted less than 120 years, and it only had 6 monarchs, one of whom sat on the throne for only 9 days and was never crowned. So you do have some people arguing that no, there weren't 6 Tudor monarchs, there were only 5. But I'm calling them 6. There were 3 male monarchs first, Henry VII on the left here, who I just mentioned, his son, Henry VIII, who is very famous, and I'm sure many of you know who he is. And then to the right of Henry VIII is Henry VIII's son, Edward VI. And then there were 3 female monarchs. Lady Jane Grey, she was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII through his daughter Mary. Again, she only ruled for 9 days before she was deposed. Mary I in the middle here, she was the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And then on the right, again, a very, very famous monarch, Elizabeth I, who was the daughter of Henry VIII and his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Now, the Tudors are probably the best known of all historical dynasties in Britain. There have been countless books and films and TV shows devoted to the Tudors. And you can see a couple of stills here. This is Charles Laughton on the left from The Private Life of Henry VIII from 1933, showing Henry as a lot of people envision him, big, gluttonous man here, chewing on the chicken bone there or whatever he's eating. And then on the right, Flora Robeson in Fire Over England, another very famous film from the 1930s, depicting Elizabeth I. And then I love this one. I've never seen this. I would love to find a copy of this. This is the renowned actress Sarah Bernhardt. This was a silent film, The Loves of Queen Elizabeth. And this was a French film, actually, that dated to 1912. And again, I love this still, although she doesn't look like Elizabeth as we think of her today. More modern movies, Lady Jane on the left here, about Lady Jane Grey, her 9-day reign. This one in the middle, a lot of you may be familiar with, Anne of 1,000 Days with Richard Burton and Geneviève Bujold. And then on the right, Cate Blanchett playing Elizabeth I. Books, lots of historical novels have been devoted to this era. I'm not a big fan of historical novels, but I have to say C.J. Sansom on the left here did a whole series of mysteries about a lawyer who was in the court of Henry VIII, actually working for Thomas Cromwell. They are excellent. They're very well researched, excellently done, as are the trilogy, the Wolf Hall trilogy that Hilary Mantel did. Not as big a fan of Philippa Gregory, but she's very, very, very popular with people, and she also did a lot of historical fiction in the Tudor era. TV shows, Wolf Hall, again, the 2nd season of that is coming back pretty soon. They're making it right now. That was on PBS. The Tudors, very historically inaccurate in just about every way possible. And there was even a show on in the UK, which ended up on a streaming channel over here that I didn't see it because I don't have this channel, about Anne Boleyn. And Anne was depicted by a woman of color. So, and then finally, the Broadway musical Six. I'm sure if Henry came back from the dead, he would not recognize any of these women as his 6 wives, but indeed that's who they are portraying. And I have to say it was a lot of fun. It was actually a very good play. Okay, so, oh, and my favorite depiction of Elizabeth I ever, I think the actress that nailed her better than anyone was Glenda Jackson. There was a TV series about Elizabeth I, and she starred in that, and she was also in a film, Mary Queen of Scots, where she played the same role. But I really like this photo because she's on the set, obviously, between filming. She's got the whole costume on, but she's got a mug of beer in her hand. So I love that picture. All right, so but let's get to Tudor London. What did Tudor London look like? Well, as we've discussed in previous weeks, London continued to be this large, vibrant city. It really held an unparalleled position in England. It was the center of government, the center of political life, focal point for power, lots of trade going on overseas and domestically, very flourishing economy. And people were pouring into London, looking for power, looking for patronage, looking to make their wealth, if you will. So during the Tudor era, the population of London basically quadrupled. It started out fairly small. It started out around 50,000. And if you'll recall, London's population was about 70,000 before the Great Pestilence hit in 1348. But so it was lower than that because of the Black Death. So it started out about 50,000, but by the time we get to 1600, less than 120 years, it had gone up to 200,000. So it was really, really big. A lot of people moving here coming into London from abroad, but also domestically, people just coming in to try to seek their fame and fortune. Now, we know from maps that were made during this time that geographically, London was still pretty small. So it was only about 3 miles from the Tower of London to Westminster, so from the east to the west. But this is the first time we really do start thinking about London really expanding beyond, even though it's still quite small geographically, expanding beyond that 1 square mile that we've been talking about, that where the Romans founded London and where the wall was. We start seeing more spreading out at this point. You had very crowded, narrow streets within those ancient walls, but now people were spreading out a little bit. And London was surrounded by countryside. So you could be smack in the middle of the city, that 1 square mile, and within 20 minutes of walking, you could be in the open countryside. So this map, it does a really good job of showing. So this was Roman London, as we discussed in the first week, although there was a little, they don't show it here, but there was a little enclave of the Romans over here as well. And then the medieval period, you see it is already spreading outside of those city walls, going a little further to the east and over here to the west-north. To the north and west a little bit. And then you can see how the Tudor London goes even a little bit further out than that. So we're seeing more spread around. Now, I want to talk a little bit about London Bridge, although one of the participants here, Peter, just sent me a few minutes ago. He did a presentation on London Bridge, which I'm going to try to convince him to do for Love Living at Home, because I only had a chance to glance at it very briefly, but it looks very impressive, and it's going to go into a lot more detail than I'm going into here. So Peter, feel free to share any comments on that when we get to the end of the session, or put them in the Q&A if you want to in the comments. So at this point, there was still only one bridge crossing the River Thames. London Bridge originally was built, by the Romans. It was rebuilt several times before we get to the Tudor era. But by the time we reach this period, it was a very crowded bridge. It was very busy. You can see in this artist depiction all the shops that lined both sides of the bridge. The span, the road itself that you would go through was only about 10, 15 feet wide. And it was double lane, it was 2 lanes, so very narrow. And these buildings, these shops, there were close to, I think, almost 200 of them. And you can see that some of them are quite high. So it'd almost be like you'd be riding through a tunnel. Some of them were overhanging. A lot of them overhung the bridge. Some of them you can see even overhung the water here. So it was a very narrow space when you consider you had pedestrians, you had horses, you had carriages that were trying to navigate a very narrow space, especially when you've got 2 lanes going at the same time. So the quickest way to get from the south to the north, or vice versa, was actually by boats that were called wherries. And these were essentially like water taxis. The Thames was full of them. And by the end of the 16th century, there were said to be about 3,000 of these on the river. So it was very busy. It was like a major road, practically. These were little small rowing boats. They could hold 2 or 3 people. It was said that they were a pretty comfortable way to travel across the river, as long as the water wasn't too choppy. But trips going under the bridge here, so if you wanted to go from east to west, that was much more perilous. You had these arches, there were water wheels under there. There was a lot of the way the bridge was built and with the water wheels and the water that was churning up and the depth of the river. You had kind of like almost like whitewater rapids going under there. So it could be pretty dangerous. You could capsize, the boats could capsize, you could be killed doing this. So that traffic was a little more dicey, if you will. In addition to these wherries that were on the river, you also had all of these seagoing and coastal vessels, because again, you had people doing trade coming in and out. So the Thames was like a major highway during this time. And in addition to the rivers, the roads also got very, very congested, especially down by the Thames where the warehouses were, the docks and the warehouses were. So you had a lot of people doing trade down there. The roads would get easily blocked up. There'd be gridlock. And some of the streets got so congested because people would park their carts there to offload or pick up things that were coming in on the boats. In 1586, they actually set up some parking regulations, kind of like our parking or loading docks today, I guess, or our loading zones today. So they set up regulations and they said you can only have so many carts on this street and they can only be parked for a certain amount of time. So kind of like our current parking regulations today. And part of what made all this congestion worse on the roads was, of course, the population kept growing and growing and growing. And then you had the aristocrats and the nobility and wealthier merchants who now wanted to travel by coach. So the coaches were big. So it was a crowded, noisy place. All right, daily life. We're going to look at health, poverty, housing, childhood, and religion. So health. As I said, when Henry VII became king, it was 1485. Shortly after his arrival, there was the onset of a very mysterious illness that caused numerous deaths, and it became known as the sweating sickness. And there was really good reason to be afraid of this particular plague or illness. It came on without any warning. So you get up in the morning, you'd feel fine. And then suddenly there'd be this, they said a sense of dread would kind of overcome you. You'd get a headache, neck pains, you'd start feeling weak, and then you'd break out over your entire body in a cold sweat, hence the name sweating sickness. That was followed by fever, heart palpitations, dehydration. And it was absolutely staggering because within 3 to 18 hours of the onset of these symptoms, 30 to 50% of people who were afflicted with this died. So 3 to 18 hours, just boom, very, very, very suddenly. And it was said to have killed about 15,000 people in 6 weeks. It was pretty virulent. After that initial epidemic in 1485, there were 5 further epidemics that took place, not just in London, but around England, also in between 1506 and 1551. So there were 5 of them between that time period. And scientists still don't know what caused this. To this day, doctors, medical professionals, and scientists are still trying to figure out what was this thing. They never did kind of, it's to the best of my knowledge, have not nailed it. They don't know what it is yet. But of course, in addition to the sweating sickness, Tudor Londoners suffered from a great number of other diseases. There were other plagues. There was smallpox, tuberculosis, typhus, cholera, dysentery. These were all very normal during this time period. And you would have plague doctors, and you can see one on the left here. They treated these people who were suffering from these diseases, especially the plague, like the bubonic plague and typhoid. And they would dress in these masks with these long beaks on them, boots, gloves, head to toe. They were covered head to toe, a hat, a long robe, and the clothes would be doused in vinegar because that was believed to ward away the illness. Access to healthcare in Tudor London was very sporadic at best. There were our version of pharmacies, and they sold medicines. And of course, there were barber surgeons, and the barber surgeons would cut your hair, but they would also deal with wounds. They would set broken bones. They pulled out teeth. They were kind of serving as dentists as well. But of course, medical knowledge was limited at that time compared to now. I guess it was considered good at that time, but it was not what we know it as of today, obviously. Doctors were very expensive, so most people didn't get medical care when they became ill. They treated themselves at home with homeopathic remedies, with herbs and spices and that sort of thing. Um, when they were treated, when people were treated by doctors, often it was with bloodletting or the use of leeches. So the bloodletting thing, there was a theory at this time that there were four humors in your body. And it really wasn't until the 1800s that this theory was abandoned. So it was thought that you had these four liquids in your body called humors. There was blood, phlegm, trying to remember the names of all of them here. Yeah, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. And these were the humors. And it was believed that you became sick when these humors were out of balance, when these liquids were out of balance. So often, one thing a surgeon would do is he would do some bloodletting. So they'd cut a vein on you and let the blood pour into a bowl, and that was supposed to rebalance your humors, if you would. And then the other popular cure at this time was the use of leeches. These didn't really hurt because actually leeches have an antiseptic component in their saliva, but they would put those all over your body thinking that the leeches were going to leach out any of the poisons in your body. I mentioned hospitals that the monasteries ran, and I said these were not what we think of as regular hospitals, but they did treat the ill sometimes, particularly the poor ill who didn't have places to go. So that was an option, but when Henry VIII closed down the monasteries in the 1530s, they disappeared. The city of London did open a few hospitals. The city authorities opened a few, but again, it was hard to get treatment unless you were on the wealthier end of the scale. And speaking of wealth, poverty was an ongoing problem in Tudor London, as it's always been in cities. Again, the religious houses tended to help the poor until they closed in the 1530s. So without the help of these monasteries, you had many people on the streets begging for food, begging for money. And from 1552, the government levied a poor rate tax. And this required each citizen to give money to the poor in their area, kind of a poor relief tax, if you would. But there was also very strict legislation against vagrants. You could be whipped or worse if you were caught being a vagrant on the streets. So poverty was a big problem. And again, it was exacerbated by the closure of these religious houses and no longer getting support in the same way from the churches. Just as in the medieval period, London was smelly, it was dirty, the surfaces were foul. One visitor described the pavement as so badly paved that they get wet at the slightest quantity of water, and this happens very frequently, producing a vast amount of evil-smelling mud. And that lasted a long time. So if you were living in Tudor London, what you would do is you would, in your house, you would have fresh rushes or reeds on the floor, so that when you walked in with your dirty shoes and boots, you could scrape some of that foul mud and dirt off of there. It was also, again, just as in the medieval period, really smelly because you had people cooking with wood, you had brew houses, you had soap boilers, you had the tanneries we talked about before, metal workers, so these kinds of industries, the butchers. So the smell, air pollution was very, very significant in Tudor London. And again, due to the population explosion, it was made even worse. But also, due to the population explosion, more houses were being built. They needed to build more houses. So what they did was there was a real fear of deforestation because these houses were wood for the most part. So heating and cooking sources, which had been with wood, shifted over to charcoal and later sea coal. And that contributed to the, to the air pollution that was going on in London at that time. Wealthy Londoners would wear these little devices that you see here on the upper right. This is quite a fancy little one, pommadors, and you would basically put herbs and spices in here, wear it around your waist, and you could, sniff on that to get the bad odors out of your nose. They were very elaborate designs, some of them, including the one you see up at the top right here, and only for the wealthy. But Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who was the Archbishop of York, and he also served as Lord Chancellor for a time under Henry VIII, he was credited with inventing what was called the poor man's pomander. And this consisted of a fresh orange, you can see on the bottom right here, a fresh orange that would be studded with cloves, and then rolled in cinnamon. And these became quite popular, but these were even somewhat of a luxury. They weren't inexpensive because oranges were seen as a real luxury item at this time. And talking about this reminded me that when I was a child, my mother at Christmas used to take oranges, put them in a bowl, and put cloves in them to make the house smell nice for Christmas. Housing, obviously, this is not London because there's nothing left of Tudor London. Very, very, very little, but very little to see in terms of buildings in Tudor London. So this isn't London, but this gives you a flavor for the type of houses that would have been there. They were timber framed, filled with wooden slats and plaster. They would have been narrower and higher than most of these, probably. They wouldn't have been quite as elongated as these houses were. They would have been higher. Brick was used sometimes. The chimneys were usually brick or stone. And following regulations in the 13th century designed to reduce the risk of fire, the roofs were generally tiled. So this gives you an idea of what they would have looked like. And again, wealthier citizens lived outside the center of the city. They weren't in these crowded little houses and crowded streets. They were down along the Strand, heading toward Westminster with much more palatial living accommodations and gardens and things. Children. So Tudor childhood. I got a book for Christmas that I haven't started it yet, but I'm looking forward to it on Tudor children. So they were dressed and treated like mini adults in Tudor times. And I love this painting. This is a very interesting painting. This is William Brooke and his family, done in 1567. There's some debate over which of these women is actually his wife. One of these is his second wife and 6 of their 7 children that you see here. The other is said to be either his sister or his wife's sister, but we're still not sure. Art historians aren't sure. But it's a very interesting portrait. And I love it because, again, you can see all the kids are dressed exactly like the adults are dressed, more or less. Families were large. Infant mortality was high. And again, as with the medieval period, most poor children did not have a chance to attend school. If you had a bit of money, you could pay for your children to be taught by a parish clerk or maybe at a grammar school. And again, as with the medieval period, when boys were about 14 years old, they could become apprentices to learn a trade. And those apprenticeships lasted for about 7 years. You didn't get any money working as an apprentice, but you got clothing, food, and a bed to sleep in. And that was valuable in those times if you didn't have money. And religion. This is where our friend Henry comes into play, Henry VIII. So at the onset of the Tudor dynasty, the Roman Catholic Church was all powerful in England. And during the reign of Henry VII, and even early in the years of Henry VIII's reign, traditional religious practices, things like pilgrimages, saints' holidays, religious plays, these were all commonplace. This was all commonplace at this time. A great deal of building and embellishment of churches took place, particularly under Henry VII. If you recall, when we looked at Westminster Abbey, I talked about that lady chapel that he added on the back, Henry VII added onto the Abbey. So he did a lot of building and embellishment. But it was his son, Henry VIII's break with Rome, that really defined Tudor religion. And in order to discuss this really pivotal point in British history, we do need to look at Henry VIII in a little more detail here. So if you'll recall, his father was the first Tudor king. He overcame Richard III to claim the throne in 1485. Now, Henry VIII was not initially meant to be king. He was not first in line to the throne. He had an elder brother named Arthur. Henry himself was supposed to have gone into the church, actually. So he had this older brother, Arthur, Prince of Wales. As the firstborn, he was supposed to be king. And as a toddler, Arthur was betrothed to the woman on the right here, Catherine of Aragon. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And Arthur and Catherine married in 1501. The union was a political move, like all of these marriages were at this time. And it was to kind of solidify relationships between England and Spain and sideline France while they were at it. Very common dynastic marriages that took place at this time. But unfortunately, only a few months after Catherine and Arthur married, Arthur died. He was only 15 years old. Shortly after he died, Catherine, who was 16, she was betrothed to his younger brother, Henry. Henry was 6 years younger than Catherine. But there was rivalry going on between England and Spain. Henry VII was thought to be very cheap with his money. He would not support his daughter-in-law. Meanwhile, her father, Ferdinand, over in Spain, was not paying, he didn't pay all of her dowry. So the marriage did not take place while Henry VII was alive. And poor Catherine was kind of stuck in limbo. She was stuck in England. She was writing letters to her father begging for money because she said, I don't have any clothes. My ladies, my serving ladies, ladies in waiting don't have any clothes. So she was kind of stuck in a bad place. After Henry VII died, she did marry Henry VIII. She married Henry VIII. And this is Henry on the left here, a young Henry VIII on the left. So when you think back to those other images we saw of him earlier, the Holbein painting, which is the very famous one, or the Charles Laughton, the still from the film, we often in our minds think of Henry as being this big, bloated, gross kind of man. But he was said to have been, when he was young, the perfect image of a king. He was reputedly very handsome, well-built, athletic, very well-educated. And for many years, the couple actually lived very happily together. It really seemed to be a love match. Catherine was her husband's intellectual equal, and his regard for her was so great that he named her his regent. So when he was off fighting the French in 1512 to 1514, Catherine was in charge of the country, and by all accounts, she carried out her role very admirably. Between 1510 and 1518, Catherine gave birth to 6 children, including 2 sons. But all of the children, with the exception of a daughter, Mary, who we saw, she was one of the monarchs, one of the female Tudor monarchs. All of them were either stillborn or they died early in infancy. And over the years, Henry took many, many mistresses, not unusual, again, for kings to do. He had a wandering eye, like a lot of them. And he did have at least one mistress we know of who did bear him a son, and he recognized the son, and he gave the son a noble title. But again, the son was not a legitimate heir. He had no legitimate male heirs. So around 1526, Henry became obsessed with a young lady in waiting at court by the name of Anne Boleyn. She was the daughter of an English nobleman and diplomat, and she had come to Henry's court directly from the French court. She had spent a few years in Burgundy, and then she came to the French court. And she caught his eye, not when she first came to the English court, but she came from the French court. She wasn't a great beauty, but she was considered to be highly intelligent, fashionable, charming, and seen as somewhat exotic because she came with these French fashions, and they said she even had a slight French accent. And the standard of the beauty at that time in Tudor London or Tudor England was fair hair, strawberry blonde hair, red hair, fair skin, blue eyes. Anne was dark hair. Her eyes were said to have been exceptionally dark and beautiful. So she was seen as exotic and very interesting. And by the time Henry noticed Anne, Catherine was nearly 41 years old. She hadn't been pregnant for almost 10 years. Anne, on the other hand, was said to be between the ages of 19 and 25, depending on whose account of her birth you believe. We don't have records to say for sure exactly when she was born. I think she was probably closer to 25 at this time. Now, a few years earlier, Henry, when he first noticed Anne, a few years before that, he had had an affair with Anne's sister, Mary, and then put her aside. But unlike Mary, when Henry started expressing his interest and desire for Anne did not immediately reciprocate. In fact, she didn't reciprocate for a very long time. She made it very clear to Henry that she had no intention of becoming his mistress. And he started bombarding her for years with these love letters. And I mean, he went crazy because what you can't have, you want even more. So he'd send her love letters and jewels. He gave her property. He gave her titles. He even said at one point, I will commit to having you as my only mistress, my sole mistress, like this was an honor, I guess. And Anne said, nope, 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 no, marriage or nothing. She was not about to fall into the trap that her sister fell into. And there's these letters, you could tell this man was absolutely obsessed. We don't have any of her letters because he destroyed everything. Um, but we do have letters that he wrote to her that are now in the Vatican Library. And if you look at those letters, this man was totally obsessed with this woman, and it was driving him nuts that she would not give in to him. So in 1527, Henry said, I got to figure out a way to marry Anne. I'm married to Catherine. How can I do this? He appealed to Rome for an annulment. And he said, listen, I've done some soul searching, and my goodness, I never should have married Catherine. It violated the biblical prohibition against a union between a man and his brother's widow. Well, he had already had a dispensation for that one, so he conveniently forgot that. Catherine, for her, to take control, she went to the Pope, Pope Clement VII, and she said, listen, my marriage to Henry is valid because my previous marriage to Arthur, his brother, was never consummated. I'm a virgin. It was never consummated. But there was a wrinkle in this argument that stalled things a little bit, because the morning after his marriage to Catherine, the young teenage Prince Arthur was said to have come out of the bedchamber, and he said, bring me a cup of ale, for I have been this night in the midst of Spain. And he also said, it's a good pastime to have a wife. Now, whether this is a young boy bragging because he doesn't want to admit that he couldn't perform, or whether or not they really did consummate their marriage remains to be seen. Catherine was a very, very, very devoutly religious Catholic. I doubt she would have lied about this if that was the case. Anyway, so he said, she said, a long protracted battle in the courts between Catherine, between Henry, between Clement VII, dragged on for years. Anne and Henry are getting increasingly frustrated by this. Anne does want to get married. Henry wants to bed Anne, and nothing is happening. And the Pope, he kept stalling, in part because Catherine, Queen Catherine, was the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, a very powerful man who had the Pope under his thumb. So the Pope really did not want to annoy Charles V. So Henry's like, okay, I've got to find another way around this. So he finds these historic sources, some of them going all the way back to the Anglo-Saxon period, legal documents, canon documents that said spiritual supremacy is given to the English monarch over the church. So Henry starts waving these around and say, hey, look, I found these. Actually, I'm the one. I should have spiritual authority. I should decide how this plays out. In 1532, the English church agreed to surrender its independence as well as its authority regarding canon law to the monarch. They said, okay, we'll cede it over to you. This paves the way for something called the Act and Restraints of Appeals in 1533. And basically what this act did was it removed the ability of the English to appeal to Rome on marriages of matrimony, tithing, and oblations. So Henry's like, okay, this is good. Now I don't have to ask you if I can have my marriage annulled. So we know that sometime between late 1532 and early 1533, Henry and Anne married in a secret ceremony. And if we go with the latter date of early 1533, I think it was January 1533, Anne was already in the early stages of pregnancy. And now you've got this aforementioned Act and Restraint of Appeals in place. So Henry's newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, he declared Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid, and Anne became Henry's new wife and queen. And a few months after their marriage, Henry gave Anne this very elaborate, lavish coronation ceremony. So she was crowned as queen consort, a big procession from the Tower of London to Westminster Abbey. But their marriage was not a popular one among the people because Queen Catherine had been around for a very long time. She was beloved by the people. Her daughter Mary was beloved by the people. Both Catherine and Mary were banned from court. They were banished. Catherine and Mary were separated. Catherine never saw her daughter again, which was incredibly cruel. So their marriage was not, people weren't altogether happy about this marriage. And Henry knew he still had to do more to, get the law on his side to make sure this was all solidified. So in a further bid to cement his position in power, The following year, in 1534, Henry's Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy. And basically, with this act, it created what we now know as the Church of England, and it severed ties with Rome completely. So the Pope was no longer considered to be the leader of Christendom in England. In fact, it made supporting the Pope over the Church of England an act of treason, and it made supporting Catholicism a crime against the monarch, and that was punishable by death. This was really more of a political move on Henry's part than a religious one. He was established as the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England, but this was really, he was trying to make sure Anne was she had had a baby by this time, but he wanted to make sure that any children he had with Anne were legitimate, were considered legitimate under the law. He still pretty much behaved as a Catholic. The early church after the break was still pretty much a Catholic church in many ways. They didn't have the Pope, but it was somewhat similar. And then he had a further act, the Oath of Succession, and this required Henry's subjects to recognize his marriage to Anne and to recognize any of their heirs as legitimate. And it also demanded that persons swearing the oath renounce the power of any foreign authority and repudiate any oath that they had previously made to such an authority. And as a result, this is where we start having real problems. This is where we see things start to bubble up. So many prominent clergy and counselors, most famously Sir Thomas More, who we'll talk about a little later, he was another one of Henry's former Lord Chancellors. He lost his life. Many like him lost their lives because they refused to sign the oath. They said, no, this is one step too far. We can't do this. Now, ironically, Henry's marriage to Anne did not produce the son he wished for. He was hoping she would give him a son. She gave him another daughter, like Catherine. And like Catherine, she also suffered miscarriages and stillbirths. But Anne's only child, her only living child, that first daughter, went on to become one of the greatest monarchs in British history, Elizabeth I. Anne herself was executed at the Tower of London only about 3 years after that glorious coronation ceremony that she had on what were, they say almost certainly trumped up charges. I'm saying totally trumped up charges. And again, I've done a whole presentation on Anne Boleyn that you can also find on the Love Loving at Home YouTube channel. Trumped up charges of incest, adultery, and treason, because by now Henry just wanted rid of her. And you can go listen to that presentation to get more information on that. But this leads us to the dissolution of monasteries. So I feel like might feel like we're getting away from Tudor London, but this is actually important. So the majority of churches, with this oath of succession and all of this, the majority of churches recognized Henry as their supreme leader. As far back as 1532, they're like, okay, fine. But the nation's monastic communities did not. And this launched a really serious conflict between them and the crown. In London, there were more than 30 monastic houses. Many monastic communities were very wealthy. Many owned a significant amount of land, and some extracted some very significant revenues from the local population. And there were at this time long-standing complaints among religious reformers and secular writers that the monasteries were too wealthy, that they were crooked, that they were encouraging pilgrimages to come and view these relics of the saints that weren't really relics of the saints. They weren't the bones of the saints. They were bones of donkeys or something else. And that the monks maintained an inappropriate lifestyle, not a holy lifestyle, that they had mistresses, that they had secret wives, that they were not living as monks should live. So the Act of Supremacy gave Henry access to the church's considerable wealth, as well as these monasteries' wealth. And in doing so, he decided to carry out a sort of a survey, an inventory of the monasteries, and he started investigating them. And this began in 1535. Now, he did destroy the monastic system, and it was to his great advantage financially, because the wealth he took from all of these places paid for his military campaigns. Wars are expensive, but also it suppressed any political opposition he might have, any vestiges left of Catholicism that might be opposed to him. So between 1536 and 1540, he took over and dissolved 800 monasteries, abbeys, nunneries, and friaries. And again, some of these had accumulated a great amount of wealth and land and buildings. They had been home to more than 10,000 monks, nuns, friars, and canons. Many of these monasteries were sold off to private homeowners, landowners Henry would sell the land to them and some of the buildings to them. Others were taken over and became churches. Durham Cathedral is a good example of this. And later we'll see other examples of this. And then many were just left to ruin. Many were, just left to ruin. Now, some of the funds that Henry got from all of this did finance new institutions, such as Trinity College at Cambridge and Christ Church at Oxford. But I think I said at the end of last week's lecture, I hated Henry for doing this. And one of the reasons I really hated Henry for doing this was because whole monastic libraries were destroyed, countless music manuscripts were lost. So all of this rich, detailed history of manuscripts and documents that were sitting there were totally wiped off the face of the earth. So what was the impact of London on this? Let's get back to London. Now, if you'll recall our discussion about the Charterhouse, this was a Carthusian monastery. It was very much impacted by the dissolution. John Houghton, who was the prior of the Charterhouse, he and two others in the community, they took their concerns regarding Henry's supremacy directly to Henry's court. And the result was that didn't work out well for them. All three were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Nasty way to die. You're hung, you're cut down while you're still alive, you're disemboweled, your body's ripped apart. It's awful. In fact, it was said that Houghton's shoulder was taken off and nailed to the gates of the Charterhouse as a warning to others. What I find absolutely astonishing is the remaining members of the Charterhouse community, after seeing what happened to their prior and two of their brethren, they also refused to sign the oath of supremacy. And people were a lot more religious in those days. We live in a much more secular society today. I can't imagine having that kind of commitment or bravery to risk my life that way, but they did. 4 were executed and 9 were imprisoned, where they were chained upright until they died of starvation, it is said. So they also met not pleasant ends. So with the dissolution, the Charterhouse became a mansion for wealthy noblemen. It was used by royalty. Elizabeth I met her privy council here in the days before her coronation in 1558, and her successor, James I, used the Great Chamber. I don't have a picture, unfortunately, of the Great Chamber, to create 130 new barons before he was crowned. But the Great Chamber is this big, long, kind of like a great hall. But I want to show you this because when you go, you can tour the Charterhouse, and it is quite interesting. The Great Chamber has been totally redone, but the ceiling has this pattern on it. This one square that I got this photo of, this is the only original part of the Tudor ceiling. The rest of it looks just like this, but this is the actual Tudor ceiling from that time period. So the Charterhouse monks met a poor end, and the house went on to live in many different forms. And as we know today, it's an almshouse. But what about Westminster Abbey? Well, the monks there fared much better than those at the Charterhouse. Many decided to conveniently retire, or they went into civilian life. The abbot became the first dean of the new cathedral church. So again, it was turned into a church, a parish church, if you will. And it was founded by Henry. And the prior and several monks became clergy in the new church. So they fared better. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about Thomas More, some more, Sir Thomas More, or St. Thomas More. He was sainted. And I wanted to do this because, in part, you can still see glimpses of his life in London today. As I said, he was formerly Henry's Lord Chancellor until he fell out of favor with Henry. He was a lawyer, he was an author, obviously a statesman. He was a very devout Catholic, and this is what put him at odds with Henry's divorce and remarriage, but especially with Henry's position as supreme head of the church. More owned a large property in Chelsea along the River Thames. It's now in West London, what we consider West London. At this time, it was way out in the countryside. It was not London. His manor house is long gone, but if you walk around Chelsea today, and I've walked around it extensively because that's where I always stay when I go to London, you can see vestiges and references to Life's More and his family. So on the left here, painting by Holbein, the famous court painter Hans Holbein of Thomas More. And on the right, this more contemporary statue that was put up to More outside Old Church, Chelsea, also known as All Saints Church, as a tribute to More because More worshipped in this church. Here's a look at the inside of the church. There's still some Tudor elements left in the church, although it was very badly damaged during World War II. It's a nice place to pop into. Again, nobody goes here. If you want another, it's a very small church, but it's quite an interesting church and a nice place to pop in if you're ever over in Chelsea. Now, another remnant of More's life can be found at Crosby Hall. This is Crosby Hall. It should be noted this was not in Chelsea during More's lifetime, but he did live in Crosby Hall. He rented it and lived in the house between 1523 and 24, but at that time it was situated over in the east of London in Bishopsgate, near where Liverpool Street Station is today, if you know London. Crosby Hall survived the Great Fire of London in 1666, but it was badly damaged less than 10 years later by a fire, and only the Great Hall and one of the wings survived. Then in the Victorian era, it was transformed into a restaurant. And in 1907, it was sold and scheduled for demolition. They were going to tear the whole thing down, what was left of it. Luckily, the building was saved by the London County Council, and it was literally moved brick by brick, what was left of it, down the River Thames, down to Chelsea, and it was placed on the site of where More's Chelsea estate was. So this was not what his Chelsea estate looked like, but it was a house that was a mansion connected to him. The council sold the building in 1988 to a private, very wealthy Irish businessman and philanthropist named Christopher Moran. He restored the palace, not the palace, but the hall to its former glory, and now it's a private mansion called Crosby Moran Hall. There are a lot of charity functions that take place in here. The building is not open to the public. I would die to get in this building, but it is not open to the public. But it does give you a real flavor of the Tudor time period, and gives you a taste of maybe what More's mansion in Chelsea, his estate in Chelsea, would have looked like. And you can see on the outside here, there is a plaque talking about the history of the house, and on the right, another reference to Thomas More. And these are some photos. These are a little blurry. I took these off of the website, but what the inside of it looks like now. Now, this one did excite me. I'm a geek. I can't help it. This is very interesting. This is the site of Thomas More's orchard. So if you walk around Chelsea, he had a huge estate. I mean, it spread out all over the place. This was the site of his orchard. Today, it's a Moravian cemetery, so it doesn't have headstones. It only has footstones. That's why all you see is grass. But right at the back here is a brick wall. It took me a long time to find this place. I knew it existed. I knew vaguely where it was, but boy, it took forever before I finally stumbled upon it. And on Wednesday afternoons, it is open to the public. So once I found it, I went back on a Wednesday afternoon. And right at the back is an old stone orchard, brick orchard wall. And you can still see some of the original Tudor bricks in here. So I got very, very excited. My husband just said, they're bricks. I'm like, no, they're Tudor bricks. I was very excited that you could almost like touch it and say, yeah, this is Thomas More's orchard wall. And then finally, if we return to Westminster Hall that we discussed earlier, you can see this plaque commemorating where More was sentenced to death. This is where he was sentenced to death for not signing that oath of succession. So that's Thomas More. Now, let's talk about Tudor pastimes. And we've got, I'm going to have to hustle here a little bit. So going back to Tudor London, citizens would have engaged in many pastimes, including lawn bowling, as you see depicted here. In 1511, Henry VIII declared that bowling was illegal for common people, and that, in quotes, no manner of persons could at any time play at any bowl or bowls in open places out of his garden or orchard. If you were a nobleman and you owned property valued at more than £100, you could obtain a bowling license to play wherever you wanted. And it would take centuries for these laws to actually be amended, interestingly enough. Like bowling, but it was a very popular sport among the elite. Sports such as tennis, archery, and jousting were also the purview of nobility. There were more sedate pastimes, if you will. So playing cards was popular, chess, board games. And of course, these weren't limited to the upper classes, but they were all popular pastimes. And it was during this period that the Lord Mayor's Parade, the Lord Mayor's Show that I talked about last time, this developed into a truly impressive day-long pageant and spectacle. Hundreds took part in it. Thousands of people would line the streets to see this. Bowling alleys, gaming houses, ale houses, these were all very popular. Ale houses in particular were very popular meeting places for music, for conviviality. They would even put ballots up on, they'd nail ballots to the walls of the ale houses so people could sing along. They wanted to encourage communal singing. By 1613, the city, that 1 square mile, that one administrative place, had over 1,000 ale houses. Magistrates were trying to control and limit them because they were concerned about fighting, drunkenness, other things going on. And for this reason, Southwark, on the south side of the river, became really popular because it was out of jurisdiction of the City of London, and it became a very popular place for alehouses, taverns, gambling dens, and other leisure activities, as we will see. One of those, unfortunately, a very gruesome one, was animal blood sport. London was dotted with bear gardens, and this is a place where bears, dogs, bulls, even chimpanzees would routinely fight to the death in front of crowds who just ate this up. They loved it. It was among the most beloved entertainments of the 16th and 17th centuries, including with Elizabeth I. In London, again, these spectacles took place in Southwark, on the Bankside in Southwark. And they had several purpose-built arenas. And you can see if I zoom in on this old map, you can see the bull baiting and the bear baiting ring there. So they were very, very popular. And what would happen in bear baiting, a bear would be led into the pit, chained to a stake by its leg or neck, and then people would take bets on what was going to happen. A pack of dogs would be released, usually bulldogs or mastiffs, and they would attack the bear, biting the bear, attacking the bear, tormenting the bear. And this would go on until several of the dogs were killed or until the bear was bitten into submission. Really horrible, horrible stuff. But these bears came from abroad and they were very expensive. So there was a vested interest in making sure the bears were not horribly injured or killed themselves. And after several bouts, some of these bears who took place in several bouts, they became kind of minor celebrities. In fact, there was one bear named Sackerson who was so famous. He was referenced in name in one of Shakespeare's plays, The Merry Wives of Windsor. So he kind of became a celebrity. But people loved it. I don't know, they loved this blood sport. There were critics later when we get into the Puritan period, which we'll talk about next week. Puritan ministers were very much against this. They were seen as being, not so much because of the killing the animals, believe it or not, but because they said, no, these are dens of idleness and vice. People are sitting here drinking, they're gambling, they're prostitutes walking around. So they didn't even care that much about the animals. They just cared about the general, idleness and debauchery that were going on. Despite protests from critics, England's blood sports continued unabated through most of the 17th century. London's bear baiting rings were briefly closed in 1656 under Oliver Cromwell. Again, this was a moral crackdown under the Puritan period. But it wasn't long after the restoration of the monarchy, and again, we'll talk about that next week, they were back in business again. A new one was built in 1662, and it wasn't until the 1700s that blood sports finally fell out of favor. They weren't banned outright. People just got tired of them. It wasn't until 1835, in an act of parliament, that this became illegal, that this became totally illegal. And if you walk around South London today, over on the Bankside, over in Southwark, you will see two streets. One is called Bear Gardens and one is called Bear Lane. And they mark they pay homage, if you will, to what took place in this area. But the other big thing, the last thing I wanted to talk about today, was theater in London. This was one of the most popular entertainments in Tudor London, going to the theater. And it grew out of the tradition of religious storytelling after the Black Death, back in the Middle Ages. And these plays at that time basically took the form of mystery plays, mystery cycles, miracle plays, they called them. So they would dramatize stories from the Bible and they would tell stories about the lives of the saints. And the parishes put these plays on, they created these plays as a way to communicate moral lessons to society. And these were orchestrated performances, very organized. But out of this, the concept of theater began to take place in Britain. So you had centuries of these religious inspired plays. But then Henry VIII banned all of those because, again, after he broke with the Church of Rome, he was trying to discourage he's trying to discourage basically the rise of Catholicism. So the late 16th century saw the birth of modern theater. And what happened with this is you started seeing the court, Henry's court, and you started seeing aristocratic households. They started having theatrical performances in their own homes or in the court. And these became bigger and more interesting, and people got very interested in them. And then we start seeing playhouses start to crop up. And again, they were in the city of London. The city authorities were not happy about this. They found them to be noisy and disruptive. They attracted thieves and other undesirable people, such as, and I quote, harlots, cutpurses, cozeners. Cozeners are people who cheated you, and pilferers, who, under the color of hearing plays, devised ungodly conspiracies. That quote came from a man named Anthony Mundy. He was writing in 1580. Now, interestingly enough, he was a playwright himself. So that was kind of interesting. But so the magistrates, they tried to control these things. They tried to shut them down on moral grounds and things, but they didn't have much success. And again, eventually what happened were the playhouses moved out of the city, went to the east of London, went across the river again over to Southwark to get away from those regulations. Theaters were closed down during outbreaks of plague, much in the same way we had businesses and theaters and things closing down here at the beginning of the COVID pandemic. So in 1595, city authorities ordered a ban on having any playhouses in the city of London. And that's when you started seeing these playhouses spread out to other areas. And already on the South Bank, you already had the bear baiting places, and you had the taverns, and you had the ale houses. So there was already a lot of entertainment going on over there. So it made sense to take some of the theaters over there. And you can see this map here kind of shows you in the city itself, a lot of the guild halls attached to the guild halls were places where plays would be put on. But you start seeing things cropping up on the South Bank, and then over here off the map to the east, even some to the west as well. So let's talk about a few of these very briefly. So the Red Lion Playhouse, we think this was the oldest theater in London. It was created in 1567, had a very short life, only lasted 1 year. It was built for grocer John Brain, and it was believed to be the first public playhouse in London, located in Shoreditch in the east of London, just outside the city of London. We don't know much about it. All we know about is there were 2 lawsuits, one in 1567 and one in 1569, that mentioned the Red Lion, Lyon, and mentioned a farmhouse that had an outdoor stage and seating. Buildings from the 15th and 16th century that were further developed over the next 100 years were found on the northeast corner of this site when they were doing renovations. So experts think, well, this might have been, when they were doing excavations, that this may have been part of this original Red Lion Inn. So they thought it was a farmstead turned into an inn, and then they put a theater, an outdoor theater by the inn. They found 2 beer cellars, they found bottles and tankards, so that's what made them think that this was probably an inn at one time. But they did also find a single gallery, multi-sided theater. It had a fixed stage, 40 feet by 30 feet, they estimated, about 5 feet above the audience, and it was built in the garden of the farmhouse. The stage had trap doors, it had an attached turret, you could do aerial stunts. The construction, we know from these lawsuits, cost £20, and it appears to have been a commercial success, but it really did not offer, it didn't last long because it was kind of out, it was a little further afield than people wanted to go, and was not a popular place to visit in the winter, obviously. So we don't really have any documentary evidence that this lasted beyond that first season in 1567. But you can see the excavation work going on here. They found 144 surviving timbers. They think this might have been some of the gallery seating there. But this playhouse was soon replaced by a more successful collaboration between John Braine and his brother-in-law, who was the actor-manager James Burbage. James Burbage was the father of a very famous Elizabethan actor named Richard Burbage. And again, they built this place in Shoreditch, and they called it the theater. So here's the theater. It was believed to have been the really first purpose-built theater in England for this purpose specifically, a big theater as compared to what we saw at the Red Lion one. And it was the first amphitheater style theater in London. So it kind of looks like the old Roman amphitheater design. And it did lead the way for future theaters in London. It was roofless. It was a circular building. It had 3 galleries surrounded by a yard. A yard is where the spectators would stand to watch the play. And it created this template. So you had a central yard that was open to the sky, a raised stage kind of sticking out into the yard, a roof over the stage that was called the heavens. Today, if you go into a theater and you sit way up in the nosebleed seats, that's called the heavens. But back then it was the roof over the stage. And there was galleried seating all around the yard on several different levels. That was roofed. So if you paid a little more, you could sit down, not stand up, and you wouldn't get assaulted by the elements if it was raining. And then they had a flag flying in each of these theaters that was unique to each playhouse, that kind of identified each playhouse. Now, the Red Lion had been a theater for touring companies, and it continued the tradition of these touring companies coming around. They'd go to inns, they would go to these aristocratic houses and put on plays. But the theater, this one, actually accepted long-term engagements. So they kind of had a repertory theater with the same people there, with companies based there playing throughout a season. It opened in 1576. Several companies performed there, including the Chamberlain's Men, with whom Shakespeare was associated, both as an actor and a playwright. He was not just a playwright, but he was also an actor. And they also housed fencing and athletic competitions on this site as well. Now, after James Burbage died in 1597, the theater's lease ended and the building was dismantled in 1598. And his sons used the timbers to construct what would become the first Globe Theater on the South Bank, which we'll talk about in a minute. And in 2008, archaeologists working with the Museum of London discovered the foundations of what they believe was this theater. So again, you can see here, actually, this is the next theater. Sorry, we don't have any pictures of the excavations of this one. But the curtain is a very interesting one, and this is going to have an interesting afterlife as well. It was first recorded as having opened its doors in 1577 in Shoreditch. And this was, again, near Shakespeare's earlier theaters. It was only the second theater, it's believed, built specifically to host performances. And it's believed that Shakespeare's Lord Chamberlain's Men used it from 1597 to 1599. And it's believed that Shakespeare's play Henry V debuted here in 1599. That's what we believe. Historical records really reveal very little about the theater and its construction, but we do know it's believed with excavation work that it was a timber building, 3 tiers of galleries surrounded by an open central yard where the audience stood. It had a rectangular stage. You can see the excavation work they're doing here. There were hidden passageways under the stage so the actors could move undetected underneath the stage. And they found artifacts such as glass beads, pins, maybe from costumes, they think, and fragments of drinking vessels and pipes, clay pipes. So the audience members would be drinking, or maybe the actors backstage or the crew drinking, smoking their pipes, that kind of thing. In 1580, the curtain survived an earthquake. An eyewitness described how the audience, in quotes, leapt down from the top of the turrets, pinnacles, and towers where they stood. They leapt down to the ground, whereof some of them had their legs broke, some their arms, some their backs, and many score crushed and bruised. Again, this playhouse from 1592 to 94, it was forced to close during a plague that was taking place at that time. But despite fire, despite disease, earthquakes, all these things, plays were staged here well into the 17th century. It had the longest history of use of all of London's Tudor playhouses. And the last production took place, we think, around 1625, around there. And then it was turned into tenements in the 1630s, and it fell out of use as a theater. But as I said, it has an afterlife. So here's again some construction or some pictures of the archaeology. But it has an afterlife. So a new development consisting of residential, commercial, and business offices is being built over the site of the Curtin Playhouse. And as part of this development, later this spring, I believe in April, you'll be able to go visit this visitor site, and you can look down 10 feet below to where the remnants of this theater is. And they're going to have, this is going to be part of, I think they're calling it the Museum of Shakespeare. And it is set to open in a couple of months, and it will interpret the history of the site and display some of the items that were found on the archaeological digs. All right, two more, and we're just about out of time, so I'm going to go quickly through these. Two more theaters that I can't not talk about. In 1989, remains were found of the Rose Theater, close to the Globe Theater site that we'll talk about later. There were routine excavations going on for an office building that was being constructed in the late 80s. And what they stumbled upon was the Rose Theater. This was built in 1587 by a man named Philip Henslow. It was the fifth of what would become 22 purpose-built theaters in London, but it was the first one built on the south side of the Thames. We don't know much about the first few years of the theater's life, but in 1592, Henslow started keeping account books, and these are very rich with detail. They talk about the money spent on the theater, the plays, the actors, a very rich source of information, who was wearing what costumes, who acted in what, how much the writers, actors, and others were paid, when the plays were performed, details about stage props and costumes. So a real wealth of knowledge for theater historians. And in 1592, Henslow's stepdaughter married a superstar of the London theater at that time, the actor Edward Allen. He was a very famous actor, and his association with the Rose, his acting at the Rose, really helped promote this theater as the foremost London theater to go to. So we know a lot because of these account books. We know the plays that went on there, including Christopher Marlowe's plays, Dr. Faustus and the Jew of Malta. And we know that Thomas Kyd's play, The Spanish Tragedy, and we know that Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 1, and Titus Andronicus were all performed here. But how it became to be saved was interesting. So when they were doing these excavation works and they came across this, they weren't going to save it. But there was an actor walking by at the time, just happenstance, walking by, because he was looking for the original Globe Theater site. And he came upon this. He saw these people digging. He said, "Hey, what'd you find?" Because he was wondering maybe this was the Globe. And they said, "Oh, we think it was Shakespeare's first playhouse." They had archaeologists there. And so he went back to where he was in the theater at that time at the Old Vic. And he spoke to one of his fellow thespians who happened to be Dustin Hoffman. Dustin Hoffman was appearing in Shylock at that time, appearing as Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. And he told him about this. He said, "Hey, they found Shakespeare's first theater." So Hoffman ended up mentioning this in an interview with a newspaper, a London newspaper, and public got very interested in this. The theater community started rallying around saving this theater and protecting it from redevelopment. And it had support from very prominent actors such as Ralph Fiennes and Alan Rickman, and a very ill Laurence Olivier, who basically he gave his last public speech on behalf of the Rose. So they went on, they did a bigger excavation of this site, and subsequently the Rose Theater Trust was founded. Today you can tour it. There's not much there, although I took this a few years ago. I'm not sure it's changed much since then. But there are performances and talks that you can attend on the site of the theater, and they do have some online offerings as well. So they're very devoted to preserving this site. Now, the Globe. We have to finish with the Globe. Considering that this is probably the most famous theater, or one of the most famous theaters in the world, the original Globe had a surprisingly short, although highly eventful, life. It was built by the Lord Chamberlain's men, that company of actors that included William Shakespeare. It opened in 1599, and it played host to many Shakespeare plays for 14 years. He wrote many of his greatest works during this time, including Hamlet. The theater was destroyed by fire in 1613 after its thatched roof was accidentally set alight during a performance of Henry VIII, Shakespeare's play Henry VIII. Basically, a cannon was shot and it set fire to the thatch. A new theater was built the following year in 1614, but that was demolished in 1644 when all plays were banned by the Puritan Parliament. For more than, or actually more than 3 centuries later, I should say, more than 3 centuries later, Sam Wanamaker, who was a very well-known American Shakespearean actor and director, he set up Shakespeare's Global Trust. And this was pretty much his lifelong dream of building a reconstruction of Shakespeare's Globe Theater. It took him 23 years to get the funding, to get planning permission, to find land, to do all of this. He died in 1993. The building was still under construction, so he never did see the realization of his dream. But they built it as close to the original site as possible. It's just one street nearer to the river than the original Globe Theater was. And they also did a great deal of research into how to build a theater as authentically as it was in Shakespeare's time. So they used green oak, which was the same type of wood that was used in the original building. They used the same techniques and tools that were used by carpenters in Shakespeare's time. So the timbers were fixed together using wooden pegs. One thing they could not replicate, however, was that thatched roof, because building regulations meant that the thatched roof had to be lined with fire retardant material. So they had to put fire retardant material in there. So that's the Globe. Again, lots of very popular place. If you haven't been, if you don't want to stand for a performance, you can sit in the galleried seating undercover. I think you can even rent cushions, if I recall correctly, because the seats aren't that comfortable, but it is an experience. And if you don't even go to a play, you can tour the theater itself. So next week, we're going to leave the Tudors behind to visit the Stuart period, the next time period. This was a time period that saw another plague, a great fire, and the execution of a king, and several years when there was no monarchy at all. And we'll also look at both Tudor and Stuart architecture next week. So with that, I am going to get out of here, stop my screen sharing, and see if anybody has any. Let's see, there's one comment down in chat. I am not muted. Not sure. Oh, could you hear me during this whole thing? Or was I muted during this whole thing? It doesn't show me being muted. Is that Peter, is that yes, I was muted, or no, I wasn't muted?
No, you weren't muted.
Okay, I don't know what that message was from her.
I have to turn my computer up to 100% audio
Oh,
to hear
sorry.
you.
Usually I'm told I have a too loud booming voice.
So what's the current status of the Globe? I heard it was in financial trouble, the rebuild.
Yeah, it's a little shaky at the moment. There was actually some talk of shutting it down, but the last I heard, it's still hanging on. But I think it would be, unfortunately, actually, ironically, the Globe was probably one of the few theaters that was safe to go to during COVID. I mean, everybody closed for quite a while because England had a much stricter shutdown than we did. So a lot of the theaters really suffered. But they've also had a lot of leadership changes and some financial issues around, I think, some of those leadership changes. The last I heard, they were in trouble, but still hanging on. I haven't heard anything more recently than that. But like a lot of, unfortunately, like a lot of theaters all over, theater struggles, theater struggles. But it is a very popular tourist destination. It's really such a London landmark that it would be a real shame if they couldn't pull this out. And so I'm hoping that, somehow they'll be able to keep going on and survive. But I think a lot of it had to do with some very rocky administration too, which that coupled with COVID caused problems, but yeah. Any comments or questions? I know we went just to the bitter end there because we started a little bit late.
The only comment is, who was William Shakespeare? Was he?
Well, that's another whole story.
Was he the Earl of Oxford with a pen name?
That's about as contentious as did Richard III kill the princes in the tower, I'll tell you. People are still, and if you go on to the Rose Theatre Trust website, as I said, they do have they have quite a few online talks, and I believe they did have one on the Earl of Oxford not that long ago. I couldn't go to it, but
There was a program, I think, in the late 70s that asked on TV that asked that question. I think you can still find it.
yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
what they said was clearly Shakespeare was not a bumpkin from a country town. He knew what was going on in the court.
right,
And I think it goes back to Mark Twain saying, well, you couldn't write about the Mississippi and its boats unless you'd worked them.
right.
So Shakespeare knew what was going on.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, he
and
wasn't just a provincial. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and you could see that from lots of other plays as well. I mean, he knew what was going on in the court. He knew what was going on in Europe. He had a broad knowledge, and that's where you know, some of the debate comes in. What could this really have been one man? Could this really have been him? But yeah, there's no reason to believe he wasn't. He was trained. During the early stages of COVID, I did take part in an online, I didn't take part, I attended some online discussions from gosh, now I'm blanking on the name of the company. It's in Lenox, Massachusetts. It's a Shakespeare company. I used to go to it when I lived in Albany, a theater, and now I can't think of the name of it. But they had a female artistic director named Tina Packard, and she did a bunch of online talks about Shakespeare's life. And she talked about the fact that, he was trained in rhetoric, and he was trained, I mean, this was not an uneducated individual, even when he was younger. So this belief that he could not have written this way, not necessarily, but a lot of debate about that. Still ongoing to this day, but still very relevant. And again, I think it would be an awful shame. I mean, Zoe Wanamaker, the daughter of Sam Wanamaker, is obviously still a very prominent actress. And hopefully, if nothing else, she would rally the troops if that theater was really close to being shut down, because that was her father's dream. I mean, that was really his legacy. So it would be a real shame if it didn't survive. But we
but
shall see. We shall
just
see.
a comment on my own school life here. If a school is sort of 50 years old, they think of knocking it down. Well, my secondary school was founded in 1558.
Wow.
And some of the original buildings were still there. And in fact, I spent 3 years in this Tudor building.
Oh,
It had
wow.
obviously been extended. It wasn't all Tudor, but I spent 3 years in there. The walls were about 4 feet. It was brick. The walls were about 4 feet thick.
Yeah.
Uh, so it was interesting being surrounded by history, though, of course, as teenagers, we didn't
You didn't
appreciate.
appreciate exactly. Yeah. You're like this old,
I'll send you some pictures.
oh, please do. Yeah, I know. It is
If
on
I
your
can find
computer.
them.
Yeah, the concept of old here is much different. I remember in kindergarten, I went to a school. Well, actually, the first 3 years I was in school, but for some reason I remember this from kindergarten. I don't know why. We used to take little rest periods, naps. We had these little mats we had to lay down on the floor. And it was an old, not old by British standards, but old building, probably from late Victorian, turn of the century, maybe. And I used to lay there even as a 5-year-old and go, this is a beautiful, I love these walls. I love these big windows. I love this. And then we moved, and when I was in grade 4, we moved to a 1960s. My school became this, I had to go to the school from the 1960s, all one floor, all considered modern at the time. I thought it was the ugliest thing. I hated the school right off the bat, not only because I had to move, it's like, this is an ugly building. I don't like this building. But yeah, no, yeah, the concept of old is much different here than there for sure. Other comments or questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for sticking around so late. Again, whistle stop
I
tour.
have one. I
Oh,
have one.
yes.
This is
Go ahead.
Stephanie.
Oh,
Hi.
hi, Stephanie. Hey, what's up?
Hi. I wanted to find out, was it the Crosby House that you were talking about? It was so long ago. I should have wrote it down.
Crosby
That you were
Hall.
just, yeah.
Mhm.
Was that actually in a completely different location,
Yes.
and then they took it to the Thames or whatever and restored it.
Yes. Yeah, it was originally in the east end of London in an area called Bishopsgate. And that was the house that Thomas More rented. But as I said, it was heavily damaged by fire. So the Great Hall and only one of the wings remained. And then the council sold it in 1907. And they basically, brick by brick of what was left of it, it was going to be demolished. It was going to be demolished, and then it was saved. And they moved it brick by brick, put it on the Thames, on boats on the Thames, and basically sailed it, took it down the Thames from east to
awesome.
west, from the east end of London over to the west, and reconstructed it on the site where Thomas More's original manor would have been. Where his original manor would have been. But again, it was at that time when they reconstructed it, the whole thing wasn't there. So what you see today is a lot of it is a reconstruction that this Christopher Moran did to make it look again in the style of what it would have looked like then. Some of it's still original.
But did he try to base it on historical information?
No.
No.
That's a good question. I don't know if they had plans for it someplace. They probably did have plans for it. I mean, I know we've got plans of Thomas More's plans from just looking at the estate itself. So not what the building would have necessarily details of what the house would have looked like, but the gardens and the layout of the land. That's how we know where the orchard was. When Moran restored it, whether or not he was working off of plans from the original Crosby Hall, that would be my guess, because he took it over in the 80s. So even though he's honoring Thomas More, I don't think he was worried too much about what Thomas More's estate looked like. I think it was more, but I don't know if there were actual plans from the original Crosby Hall that he worked off of, or if he was just, they were going on what was left, maybe some digging around there, and trying to reconstruct it that way. I can look on the site.
I just think the historical trust and those kind of things, when I was over and toured extensively Great Britain, it was just magnificent how they took all these estates and whatnot that were completely, I mean, they would have to take off the roof so they wouldn't have to pay taxes, and yet the roof was there, and whatnot. And they put so much into trying to restore, the original once somebody came along or some, trust or whatever came along. I just thought that was absolutely amazing. And I love the story of Thomas More, so I'm glad I was able to be able to come in, although a little bit late, but perfect timing, because when you were showing the pictures of London's Tudor houses and whatnot, I can remember those. That was a perfect picture. And
yeah, that wasn't London, but yeah, there's not much of the Tudor.
They're still over there, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
And the last comment before I let you go is when you were talking about the stone wall that you finally found, and your husband said, "It's a wall, it's a wall." I was laughing hysterically, because some people get like that with me when I get so into something and whatnot. But yeah, I hear you, and I relate and identify. Thanks a lot.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I was jumping for joy, and he's like, "Oh my God, you've dragged me all." We were walking from one end of Chelsea. I know where it is, but I thought it was on this street. No, it's not. I thought it was on this street. And then finally, I'm like, "Oh my God, there it is!" And I was just so excited. And Pat, and he's like,
"It reminds me of that book that was turned into a movie where they were going all over the place finding clues for whatever. It reminds me of that, because it takes you all over the place and whatnot. And
I was determined to find it. It was sitting on a little side street, but I finally got there in the end. Yeah. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Good.
All right. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, I got a few interesting statistics on London Bridge, which I brought up. which were
Yes.
interesting. By the Tudor period, there were 200 buildings on the bridge. Some were up to 7 stories high. There was a public latrine in the middle.
Oh, public latrine. I didn't know that part.
The available roadway was only 12 feet wide.
Yeah.
And the Southern Gatehouse was the scene of one of London's most notorious sights, a display of severed heads of traitors impaled on pikes
Yeah.
and dipped in tar and boiled to preserve them against the elements.
And if you go to London Bridge today, at one end of London Bridge, there is and I've got a photo of it someplace, a tall metal spike. It's just this tall, thin, very modern looking sculpture. That's just a spike. And that denotes where those heads were at the end of the bridge when they put the heads there. Yeah.
Yeah, the Tudor London Bridge was actually built in, I think, 1100 and something, and it was demolished in the early 1800s because that was when London Bridge was indeed falling down.
Yeah.
And the Victorian London Bridge was demolished, I don't know, in the 70s or something like that. So that's
Well, that's the one they moved over to Arizona, right? Because
that's correct.
yeah,
Yes.
they moved that bridge over to Arizona.
And then, but I believe, and my brother might be able to comment on that as he's closer. Apparently, the new London Bridge, the latest one, is not in brilliant repair.
That's not totally surprising. I still had to laugh. It was when they opened the Millennium Bridge. I don't know if you remember that whole debacle, but when they opened the Millennium Bridge, because it's a suspension bridge, when they first opened it, they hadn't, I don't know, calibrated it correctly or whatever. So the first few days when people were walking across it, they were literally falling down. Some of them were getting nauseated. So they had to shut it down almost immediately and redo it after this big hoopla about this newest bridge in London. And then turned out to have some problems. But I think you should do that presentation for Love Living at Home.
Yeah, sure. I can do
Yeah,
it.
I will bring it up to the program. I mean, I'm on the program.
I
committee.
agree.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I only got to glance at like very quickly before this started.
I've got a series of slides on it with the pictures through the
Yeah, I saw this. That's what I was looking at. I didn't see the notes, but I saw the slides. I went, oh,
Yeah.
you should do this. You should. So I will suggest that to the program committee. Because I think that'd be a great complement to this, to what we're talking
That would fit after this, yeah.
Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely. Absolutely. Other comments or questions? Okay,
Well,
well, we're
thank you
halfway
very
through.
much, and very interesting as usual.
Well, you're welcome. Have a good rest of the week, everybody.
Thanks, Deb.
You're
Bye.
welcome. Bye.
Oh, what are you doing next week?
Next week is Stuart London. So we're chronologically
yeah.
going through. So it's the continuation of the history of London. Each week is a different
Okay.
era, a different time period.
Okay, I hope and I pray I can get on that one too, because I love the shorts as well.
Well, and
All right.
also, they're all recorded too, Stephanie. So you can find them on the YouTube channel, on Love Living at Home's YouTube channel. They'll be there as well.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.